Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Julian Duerschmidt, who is VP of Business Development at Geodis Supply Chain Optimization. And today we're going to talk about tariffs and trade wars. Is anybody winning? Now, if you've been reading the news over the past few days, you probably know that on September 1st, the U.S. is planning to impose new tariffs on imports from China, starting on September 1st. And that's on top of those that are already in place. And then, China looks to return to favor, and they announced that they're going to impose tariffs on U.S. imports, also starting on September 1st. So this escalating, trade war continues to add risk and complexity, to supply chains in virtually all industries today. So what have been some of the business impact so far? What actions can companies take to mitigate, some of these challenges that they're facing? And, are there any positive outcomes from all of these activities? Well, those are some of the questions we're going to address in today's episode. And it's great to have Julian back on the program to share his insights and perspective and experience on this topic. So, Julian, welcome to the program.
Adrian, thank you very much. It's great to be back on the show and look forward to this topic. It's a very timely topic, as you know. You can't go a day without reading new things that are going on in the world of tariffs and trade wars. So yeah, I look forward to having this discussion. We certainly don't have all the answers. And I think in addition to risk mitigation and all these other things out there, the biggest question out there is really the certainty or uncertainty of what's going on and what's going to happen. And I think we can talk about it today, but we still won't answer that question because tomorrow it's going to change.
Right. Well, as we've seen, in this age of social media, all it takes is for one tweet to kind of change the direction and the stock market and everything else. So you never quite know what's going to appear on Twitter. Even as we speak here today, things might be changing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like I said in my opening comments, both the U.S. and China, are planning to impose new tariffs on each other. The first round, I guess, being September 15th. The next round, September 1st, and the second round being on December 15th. But before we kind of focus on what's going to happen, let's take a step back and kind of assess the impact of the tariffs that are already in place. I mean, what has been, the impact in terms of, costs, jobs, imports, and so forth, and which industries have been affected the most?
Well, if you take a step back, it really goes back about a year and a few months. The first industries to really be affected by the tariffs were the steel and aluminum industry, washing machines, solar panels, things like that. Those were the first areas that got hit with the tariffs. And quite honestly, it did create cost increases. So as we went through the year last year, companies such as Ford Motor Company said that they incurred over $1 billion of additional costs, primarily due to the tariffs. The steel industry did, benefit with some jobs. But I read one article from Forbes recently that said for every job that was added in the steel industry, 16 additional jobs were lost as a result of the tariffs. So many companies, and if you look at the steel industry today, this year, their business isn't doing so well. Most of these companies, U.S. Steel, Alcor, others like that, their stock prices have been hit pretty significantly. And companies are actually starting to lay off or slow down on production right now because overall their economy is slowing down and their business is going down.
Yeah, no, those are great examples. I mean, and it started obviously there with the steel and washing machines and so forth. But now, over the course of the year, you've had additional tariffs, and now the ones that are coming up in the pipeline are going to impact more consumer goods, if you will. And that was really, some of the concerns that, companies and now economists and so forth are having because, basically the breadth of these, and the reach of these tariffs is growing, larger and larger, right?
So, Adrian, up to this point, it's really been the industry, industrial components and raw material providers, things like that have been affected, or companies have been affected. The consumers really haven't felt it yet. But having said that, one of the other, big results of, or I guess consequences of some of the tariffs and the oncoming trade war is, the farmers have been hit very hard, and they were the first to get hit significantly last year. And they've been hit again this year as their business and as these tariffs continue to be high, and their biggest market in the world has been virtually closed off to them. So they've suffered, as well as other companies this year. Companies just recently, Caterpillar and Deere both said they've lost over $100 million, or not lost, they've paid an additional $100 million in costs this year to manage the tariffs, and the year is only half over. So they've got more costs to come, and again, tariffs are going up. One of the things I read this last weekend is they are implementing new tariffs on September 1st and December 15th, but also in October they're bumping the current tariffs up to 30% from 25. So it's not over. There's a lot more costs that are being absorbed by businesses today that aren't going to be able to be absorbed much longer.
Well, that's true. And, coincidentally, last week we surveyed our Indago members. So, Indago is our community of supply chain logistics practitioners from, manufacturing, retail, distribution companies. So if you go to joinindago.com, you can learn more about it. So we surveyed them last week on what has been the impact of the China tariffs on your supply chain, costs. And 20% of our member respondents said that their supply chain costs have substantially increased, and another 60% said that they have moderately increased. So, over 80% of those of our members that responded to the survey said that costs have either moderately or substantially increased, over the past year as a result of this. So I think that's in line with everything you just said and some of the headlines that we're seeing out there. So from a supply chain standpoint, I mean, what's been the impact as well? I mean, especially from a transportation and warehousing standpoint, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, it's a good question, Adrian. And it's surprising because you would think you'd see a big impact here, but surprisingly we haven't. We've seen some downturn in overall volumes are down slightly. So on the import side, container volumes into the West Coast are down a couple of percent. Domestic trucking volumes are down a couple of percent, but you're not seeing significant downturns at this point. And some of that reasons is because of the uncertainty that the trade or the tariffs create. Companies are actually bringing more inventory in. So if you look at warehousing in Southern California in particular, those warehouses are maxed out at capacity today. They are struggling to find any kind of capacity because companies have brought in the additional products they needed for the fall season. And now with I think what was the headline I read this weekend? Trump saves Christmas, where he delayed the consumer taxes or tariffs until December. So companies are bringing in more and more of these products ahead of time, and they're filling up the warehouses. So the warehouse business is actually a good place to be right now because you're able to get some pretty good premiums on your pricing, and your warehouses are full.
Right. So basically what we're saying is, companies, pulling in, product that
absolutely.
might have been, so you're creating the spike in imports, if you will, or at least not, bringing in stuff earlier than they might have, in the past in order to beat out some of these tariffs. So I mean,
will say one thing I will say though is just recently in the last couple of months, the manufacturing PMI, that's used to measure, how much supply chain manufacturing activity is going on. That's actually now gone below the 50 level, if you will, which means we're actually not growing anymore. And so they're actually seeing overall supply chain activities, contracting.
Right. Sometimes it's difficult to unravel, all the factors that go into, some of these trends. But certainly, if you look at the transportation environment today in 2019, very different than it was in 2018, where there was a lot, capacity crunch and rates were at record high. And, so things have definitely eased out, in 2019. Some of that might be just, a slowdown in manufacturing. Some of it might be, due to these tariffs. It's hard to kind of tease out exactly what all the factors are. But certainly, things are a little bit softer, if you quote unquote, this year, particularly from a transportation standpoint than last year. Now, you mentioned, companies like Caterpillar and John Deere that, been in the headlines in terms of talking about the amount of tariffs that they're going to end up paying, this year. I mean, how much money ultimately is the U.S. collecting on all these, tariffs from U.S. imports that are already in place? And, is the money collected greater than the costs associated with these tariffs?
It's another good question, because there is obviously a lot of money being collected, and more to come as new tariffs are put in place. So if you look at the past year or so, about $63 billion of tariffs have been collected, but it's a little misleading because and we're referring just really to tariffs from China. So if it's a bit misleading, because in the past we've always had tariffs. There have been tariffs, small tariffs, 5%, 10% on a lot of different goods. So about $30 billion of these tariffs collected are just ongoing tariffs and money that's been collected in the past. But if you look at the new tariffs, which they're saying, 27, 30, 33 billion, somewhere in that range. And again, it does change a bit where you look and day to day as things change. But there is an additional 27, 28 billion dollars of tariffs have been collected. In June, in particular, we saw about $6 billion in new tariffs. So that's really becoming the new level, if you will. So as we go forward, you'll see even higher tariffs being collected. But if you look in the past, yes, we've collected nearly $30 billion in tariffs, of new tariffs. But we've paid out about $28 billion, because last year, if you recall, the farm subsidies were $12 billion. And then more recently, another $16 billion were earmarked for farm subsidies. So we have paid out about, what we've collected in new tariffs so far. And then, the question still is, are we going to continue down the path of these tariffs? Are they actually going to come in play in September? I assume that one will, but what about December? So, there is still some uncertainty around whether those tariffs will actually happen.
That's a good point. I mean, I think when you look at it from this kind of holistic, perspective, and when you look at some of these ancillary costs, right? So yeah, you can see the increase in the amount that you're bringing in on the new tariff side. But when you look at things like subsidies that we're giving to farmers, they cancel each other out. And then when you look at some of the other costs that companies are incurring and so forth, I think it's kind of looking at it from that holistic perspective that kind of gives you the big picture of whether these things are having a positive impact or negative impact. And I think I think from what you said and from my perspective is, at best, we're breaking even here, and more than likely, the scales are tipped on the side of this is a negative ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, even if the farmers get their money and say they break even, which I hear they're not, but say they break even on the money, the bigger issue is the long-term losses that they're going to incur, because longer term, if they don't have the markets, they're going to grow less, and they're not going to have the markets in the future. If the tariffs go away, for example, they won't be able to respond as quickly.
Right. No, I think that's a great point, because I mean, there's the short term kind of impact and ramifications of all this, but then there's also the long term, right? Even if this thing went away tomorrow, it's not like it's going to revert back to the way things were, overnight. I mean, there has been some, longer lasting, implications of this as well. So I'm sure that with your clients and the companies that you work with, I know with the shippers that I talk to, the manufacturers, retailers, I know they're looking to their logistics partners as another source of number one, knowledge in terms of what we're doing here, in terms of helping them with ideas and actions that they can take to mitigate some of this impact. I mean, what are you hearing from your customers? I mean, what actions are they taking, or based on what you're doing with other customers? Mm-hmm. I mean, what can companies do in response to this trade, war? I mean, what are some of the challenges involved with some of those actions?
Well, certainly the short-term challenges are, can we source products from different locations? So companies are coming to us saying, can you help us quickly respond to needs to ship from Vietnam versus China and ship from other parts of the world? But keep in mind, it's tough to make those moves if you haven't put in the supply chain activities previously, in particular in manufacturing. From a shipping perspective, we can provide great visibility, and we have control towers that can help manage and change things and move things around very dynamically and very easily. But if you haven't put in manufacturing in different countries, you're gonna be at a shortfall. What we are seeing, is certainly Vietnam. Shipments from Vietnam, imports from Vietnam this year are up 60%. I've been in the supply chain world a long time, and I question whether that's production that's up in Vietnam, or if you're seeing shipments from China perhaps being rerouted somehow through Vietnamese companies. your guess is as good as mine on that one. But in terms of just getting yourself in place, one of the things that happened, years ago, and I was a part of it too. I headed up a global supply chain for a company 15, 20 years ago, and we made a quick move to China with a lot of our manufacturing. Now, in some cases, the businesses said, hey, I don't want to move it all there. Well, today that's probably a smart thing, because if you've got a balanced manufacturing, you may be able to avoid importing more products from China at this point in time, handling it with your domestic production.
Yeah, it's a great point, particularly around Vietnam. There was actually a great article in the Wall Street Journal, last week, specifically on Vietnam and how that's become a focal point for a lot of companies in terms of looking to source product from there or build a manufacturing base there. But the article really highlighted some of the constraints. I mean, it takes years sometimes to build out, or it took years to build out that strong skilled labor base in China, the supplier base in China and so forth. Yeah. And that just isn't there in Vietnam right now in terms of the skilled labor force, the amount of suppliers, and all the ancillary things that you need to have a great manufacturing sourcing base. Companies are moving there and they're starting to put that in place, but it's not, it's not something you can just flick on the switch and immediately move your supply chain. It's something that takes months, if not years, to fully get there.
No, you're so right. Those countries need the infrastructure. They need the port infrastructure. They need the road infrastructure and rail infrastructure. China has that all. They've built it, but they started 25, 30 years ago. And over time, they've built an incredible infrastructure. So companies that are sourcing, highly unskilled labor to do, apparel, footwear, those kind of industries probably can move fairly quickly. But when you're talking about complex manufacturing and industries where you're investing $100 million in a plant to build something, those are the companies that are having pause right now, because how can you recommend to your board to strategically place these kind of facilities and invest this kind of money in your supply chain when there's so much uncertainty here?
No, correct. Absolutely. So, I mean, going off our title, I mean, is anybody, winning here? I mean, any positive impacts to all of us?
Good question. I'll tell you one area where we're getting a lot more questions these days is in the area of trade compliance. People are coming to us and saying, hey, so what do we do? What is the rule today? They're depending on us or counting on us to be up to speed with the latest and greatest of everything going on in the market. And we're putting a lot more effort into that. From our business at Geodis in the supply chain group, optimization group, we manage 3 central or regional control towers globally. So those control towers, we're continuing to educate these people on the latest and greatest of what's happening country by country. But other people that are winning is, companies that produce robots, and artificial intelligence is becoming more important. Automated facilities. So as companies are building out warehouses, and e-commerce has certainly helped with this surge, the robotics industry is doing quite well, because with the unemployment so low, there is not a lot of labor available in markets, so they are putting in more automation and robots into the warehouse. Consumers at this point haven't been affected either, so I don't know that they're winning, but they're certainly not losing yet, because they haven't felt it in their pocketbooks. Most of the people, the articles I've read over the past 6 months or years say, the tariffs are going to affect consumers by about $1,000 a year in their pocketbooks on the average consumer. Well, that really hasn't happened yet, because a lot of the consumer-related products keep getting delayed. They were delayed from earlier this year. Now it's September, December. So the consumer hasn't felt that yet. So in a sense, they're winning while business is going through these uncertain times.
A couple of things that you said there kind of resonate with me. First is kind of this increased focus on and importance of trade compliance and knowledge in that area, and skills and expertise in that area, and the fact that companies are coming, to you and third-party logistics providers, for that kind of insight and advice is I think is key, and it kind of resonates with. I just today we published on Talking Logistics a post that highlighted what we viewed as one good outcome of this, and it was really raised by one of our Indago members in the comments, where he's the International Trade Compliance VP, and he said that he is having conversations with executives of his company that he never had before, and it's basically elevating his role within the company, because he's now in the position of having to educate the
Sure.
CEO, the CFO, people in manufacturing, and across the company about what these tariffs mean, what potentially can be done, so on and so forth. And that's drastically different than it was 10, 15 years ago, where I remember a VP of compliance at a pharmaceutical company. She was completely frustrated. I remember her quote to this day. She said, "A company would never think of hiring someone in finance from just off the someone from just off the street and put them in finance." But that's exactly what they do in trade compliance. They just view it as paperwork. And today, any company that views trade compliance and everything that's happening in global trade as just paperwork, well, they're setting themselves up for failure, because obviously, this is a very high level issue right now that's impacting the bottom lines of companies and the strategies that they take moving forward. And then secondly, the robotics piece. I mean, companies are looking for any ways to mitigate the cost impact across their supply chain. And if they're able to save money on transportation or save money in warehousing, and particularly in housing, we've seen the same thing. The investments in automation and robotics in this whole area has been increasing, and part of the driving force behind that is because part of what's happening in the labor market, but part of it is also, hey, you know what, we're facing increased costs on this side of the equation. We got to find ways to mitigate that on this other side of the equation, which is on the warehousing and distribution side. So, great feedback there.
I bet CFOs are cuddling up close to their trade compliance people these days, because they got to know. So do I put 10% on my P&L costs, or do I put 25%? And when do I do this? So it's a big issue today at the board level.
Right. Yeah. So if you're in the compliance business, whether internally at a company or at a logistics service provider or a consultant, you are winning. You're definitely one of the winners in this whole thing. So, Julian, we're running short on time here. So just as a way to wrap up, I mean, when it comes to ultimately successfully navigating the risks and uncertainties, that we're seeing here in global trade, I mean, what factors or attributes will ultimately separate the leaders from the laggards?
Well, it's an uncertain question, because you're uncertain about what's really going to happen. But the ones that have put in the alternative manufacturing, that have established what I would call more regional production facilities and supply chains to support those regions, they're certainly going to have an edge on what goes on in the future, or they'll have the ability to avoid any cost increases due to the tariffs. If you're looking at outsourcing, that can help some, but again, oftentimes it's really the production of where the products are produced that are going to determine the amount of the tariff. Visibility, having a lot of visibility can help, but again, I'm not sure that with the uncertainty of where the tariffs are going to end, and the fact that you hear, well, today it might be Mexico, or it might be France, or it might be the EU. We don't really know, who's going to have, the tariffs affect them the most. And so it's a difficult time. So I'm not sure that I can tell you who's going to, how you're going to be a leader in this, unless you've already established the flexibility in your supply chain.
No, great point. I mean, what I always tell folks is, obviously, number one, you got to stay informed of what's happening, right? And even though it's, like we said at the beginning, just wait a minute and everything could change all over again. But you have to stay informed of what's happening, because it is a fast-moving, environment out there. Secondly, I think some of the things I've seen is just doing, these what-ifs analysis, right? And just doing some of this scenario planning, because there is so many different scenarios that could happen. But at least running them out and simulating them and trying to figure out what impact some of these scenarios might have on your supply chain, and what actions you could potentially take that you have some flexibility around. So at least doing that homework up front, so that if and when one of those scenarios comes true, you can then take appropriate action. I think that's an area where I think a lot of logistics service providers are helping their clients, is in running those simulations and
talk to your suppliers, talk to your logistics providers, on a very regular basis, because they are much closer to what's going on.
Absolutely. Well, Julian, I always say that we always just manage to scratch the surface on these topics, and but you did provide some great insights in terms of what's happening right now in the world of global trade and the trade war between the U.S. and China, and kind of some ideas in terms of things that companies ought to be thinking about and maybe some actions they should be taking, in response. So I appreciate you making the time to be with us today.
No, my pleasure, Adrian. Thank you very much.
And I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on Talking Logistics or at the Geodis website and you've got a question or a comment for Julian, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.